Are you going to bring up the next program, or would you like me to do that?
I would love to have it brought up by one of us.
No, that's the virtual garden walk.
Virtual garden walk, yes. Yeah, July 20th. That's the date for that.
Oh, 20th, yeah. Today's the 20th.
Yeah, today's the 29th. All right, well, they're coming in. We got up to 68. I'm wondering if we'll hit 100 this month. Yeah, I think next month that virtual garden walk is going to be pretty popular.
I hope so.
72, it's not yet 7. Hello, everybody that's made it. We'll take a few minutes to let people filter in.
Okay.
Make yourself comfortable. Most of you will not be able to see yourself. I don't know if you've been to these before, but you should see us, me and Tom, one of us. We'll let some people filter in. So before we get started, let me start talking about weeds. I have a lot of them. I have some things I don't know if it's something I planted or if it's a weed. So I'm like waiting to see what it does. That's always fun. So welcome all you new people coming in. This is our Master Gardeners Presents via Zoom. We're talking about weeds today, and we'll be getting started in a couple of minutes. Question. We have a Q&A on the bottom. If you want to ask questions, we'll take questions and answer them at the end. There's also a chat function down on the bottom of your screen. If you have any technical problems or you have some questions for us that I can answer for you before we get started or elsewhere, you can put your questions there. So we're going to wait a few minutes, let a few more people sprinkle in. It's only a minute after 7 now. Up to 80. Wow. Oh, Sue Elliott thanks us for doing this. I think it's kind of fun. Up to 83. Welcome everyone that's come. We'll be getting started in a few minutes. Let's people filter in, give them a few minutes. Everyone might not log on right away at 7. There is Q&A and chat boxes at the bottom. If you want to ask questions, we'll take questions and answer them at the end of the presentation. If you're having any trouble, you can put it in chat and I can try to help you. Zoom is pretty easy. Oh, Laura Millette says, thank you so much. I just moved from a desert, so this will be helpful. that is quite a different area from sand to clay. We're up to 86.
While we're waiting to open up here, those of you can see the screen. Master Gardeners have this helpline service, which is Gardener SOS. So if you have any questions, send us an email. It's gardenersos@outofgamey.org. And we'll get back to you in a couple days, hopefully with a correct answer. So if there's anything that's non-weed related, or if you think of something in the middle of the night, send us an email.
That's a great service. That's when I get questions too, right in the middle of the night. I'll think, what is that? All right, we're just at about 7:05, and I think we'll get started and let people come in and catch up. Welcome everybody to Master Gardener Presents via Zoom. We're talking about weeds, how to identify and control them, tips from our very own Master Gardener, Tom Wentzel. He's an expert at this. And I'll let you take it, Tom.
Okay. I just mentioned that if you've got any questions that you think of later on, just send us an email to gardenersos@outgamey.org. And we'll get into the program. This is something that I've been extremely proud of. If there were a category at the county fair for weeds, I think I would have won the prize. It's not like I've got this huge wooded lot and it's in the back 40. I've got a typical city lot, and it was hiding behind one of my trees. So I'm pretty good at growing weeds. There's several different ways of categorizing weeds, and I'm going to start out with some of the weeds that really have to take special note of, and those are noxious weeds. And basically, those are plants, weeds that are a problem, that are causing some difficulty in the environment. Buckthorn, we've all heard about that. The other one, purple loose strife, is one that's a bit of a success story. 10, 15 years ago, there was a lot of it around, and it was choking up the waterways. Some of the master gardeners took on a project of growing beetles, and that had essentially eliminated that weed. One other one that you probably have seen but didn't know what it was field bindweed. And that one it's a vining weed that has a flower that looks like a morning glory. It is in the morning glory family. And it's, someone told me that the reason it's called field bindweed is that when it gets into farmers' fields, it binds up the harvesting equipment. But it's extremely deep-rooted, very hard to get rid of. But you'll be seeing it in your garden probably. A couple other ones, Japanese honeysuckle. Some of these were brought in as ornamental plants and have gotten away and are now causing problems. Another one that we've seen a lot is garlic mustard, and it is all over the place. The one thing about garlic mustard is it is a biennial. So it grows the first year, and then the second year, it's a different looking plant and it flowers. And that thing is just all over the place. Now, when you've got a noxious weed, it is by law something that you have to eradicate. You can't just, oh, well, I've got it. You have to do something to get rid of it. And we'll talk about how to treat that a little later on. Now, there's a couple lesser categories, and those are invasives. And there's a couple different subcategories of that. So regulated, sometimes I've seen it as restricted. Now, those don't rise to the level of problems that we see with the noxious weeds, but it's still something that we do need to take care of. And I picked out a couple here that are kind of surprising. Amber maple. I've got two of them. Black locusts, those are common landscape trees. Buckthorn we've heard about. Hybrid cattail. This is an unusual one. because the non-invasive cattail reproduces from seed. This one also reproduces by rhizomes, and it is tending to crowd out good species. The point here is that some of these things, there are varieties that are perfectly fine and beneficial, and there are other hybrid varieties like this that are a problem. Telling the difference can be difficult, and that's where something like Gardener SOS would come in. Wild parsnip is another one that people should be aware of. The flower looks quite a bit like Queen Anne's lace. It looks exactly like Queen Anne's lace, except it's yellow, whereas Queen Anne's lace is white. If you've got this one, it is a dangerous plant, because if you get the sap on your hands and you get into the sun, it can cause some severe chemical burns. So if you have that one, if you get exposed to it, take a shower immediately, stay out of the sun, and put your clothes through the laundry. So it is something that you will need to watch out for. Russian olive, that's another ornamental tree that's gotten kind of crazy. We don't see it very much around here as a problem, but a couple of years ago, I took a tour around the north side of Lake Superior, and it's as common as buckthorn up there. So that's a problem we have to look at. Non-regulated or non-restricted ones are basically those plants that have come in from wherever, they're not native, that are kind of taking over. They're not really that bad, and they do have some benefits, but it's something that we do want to at least try to keep in check. So some interesting ones there are Scotch pine, Norway maple, lily of the valley. Again, these are ornamentals that were brought in with good intentions and have gotten a bit crazy. Bird's foot trefoil, I love that name. But if you drive down any country road or wherever where the roadside is mowed, you'll see these beautiful yellow flowers. That's bird's foot trefoil. And it is kind of taking over, but it does work as a soil stabilizer, so there is some benefit from it. The weird thing is, when I've been trying to look up, what does it mean when it's regulated? Can people still sell it? Can you move it around? I wouldn't recommend moving it around, but that's one of the difficulties that I've come across in researching this presentation, is what some of this terminology really means to us as gardeners. There are about 130 invasive species registered in Wisconsin. And the regulations for these will vary from county to county. So it really is kind of a confusing situation. So if you have a specific question about a specific weed, send it to us and then we'll help you work through that. If you have a noxious weed, the best thing to do with those is to throw them in your trash. Put them in a black plastic bag, throw them in the garbage. Do not try to compost them. That's home compost bins don't get to the temperatures needed to kill the plant. We had a bit of a technical difficulty. There is a tool that's put out by the university called Wisconsin Weed ID. And what it allows you to do is go through some search criteria and pick out a weed. find your weed and it'll have a picture of it. Unfortunately, the site is down. Neither I nor Jill have been able to get into it. My suggestion when you're getting into this, when you get to the entry screen, there's three choices. There are grass, broadleaf, and woody. Most of the things you're going to be dealing with are going to be broadleaf. To follow the descriptors for grasses, you've got to be a bit of a plant geek because it gets into some very nitpicky detail about the construction of the grasses. But when you get into the selection site, the trick on this is to enter as few possibilities as you can. For instance, if you've got what I was going to use as a demo, if you got a plant that has white sap when you cut into it, enter that one parameter and you'll get, I think I got like 36 hits. Well, it's got pictures. So it's easy enough to page through 36 pictures and go to it. If you enter 2 or 3, the likelihood of you misentering something is very high. A common one is, well, this weed comes back every year, it must be a perennial. Not necessarily. Crabgrass, for instance, is an annual that comes back every year, but from seed. But because the parent plant dies, it is not classified as a perennial. So keep that in mind when you're looking, trying to find a weed. Like I say, there's 350 weeds listed there, all of them with pictures. It will not get you into, well, now that I know what the weed is, what do I do about it? That's something that you're going to have to research separately. It's just too dynamic a field that they can include everything in that one site. So unfortunately, the site was down and it crashed about an hour and a half ago on me. So here, now we're going to get into what do we do about weeds now that we know what it is. And basically, I'm going to be walking through a system called Integrated Pest Management. Now, the pest in this context is in its broadest form. You can have an insect pest, you can have deer and rabbit pests, or weeds are pests. And the thing that we try to stress on here is that you have a toolbox. You've got a bag of tricks that you can pull on to draw from to control your pest. Now, what you want to do is start with the least impactful, environmentally impactful option that you have, and then go from there. If that doesn't do it, then you need to up the ante until you eventually can get rid of the weeds. So the lowest, when we're talking about weeds, the lowest level, the least impactful, is trying to prevent the weeds. And the two big things there are mulching and no-till gardening. Mulching comes in two separate categories. You have the physical barriers. Now that's something where the weeds can't grow through it. It's best used in the pathways. Try not to use it in growing areas. You have to cut holes in the fabric and stick the plant in, which is kind of problematic if you got an annual garden. If you've got a perennial garden, perennials do have a tendency to spread, and so that gets a bit more difficult. It has a couple advantages. It does allow water and air to get through it. It is an effective barrier, but once you put it down, you can't get back at it to do your regular soil maintenance. What you want to do every year is add some organic matter to it, like compost. Well, if you've got barrier fabric down there, you can't do that. The place where it's best used is under stone and gravel. And because you're not going to be needing to augment the soil under that kind of a mulch. Where you do not want to use it is under organic materials, wood chips, straw, and that sort of thing. And the reason for that is the organic materials will break down, they'll create their own compost, which is a wonderful growing medium. So your weeds are going to start growing in that wonderful soil on top of your fabric. And then the weed roots are going to work their way through the fabric. And then it's really difficult to get the weeds out of there. And I'm sure you've seen a lot of cases where people have put down the fabric, they put their nice mulch on it, and by the end of the summer, all the mulch is kind of washed off to the side and the fabric is sticking up. So there are some difficulties with using that. Plastic sheeting, don't use it. There's no reason to use it at all. Yes, it is a very effective barrier. You can't get water through it. Soil needs to breathe. That's not going to happen. And it's going to end up, you're going to end up with compacted soil under there. So if that in the future you want to use that as a active gardening area, you're going to have to do a lot of work to get that soil back up to par. The other category is physical barriers, is newspaper or cardboard. These are some of my favorites. It's a good barrier. It breaks down. You can use it in planted area, and it's cheap or free. I particularly like using newspaper under my tomato plants. What I've found is that when you mulch them with sheets of newspaper, 3, 4, 5 layers, blossom end rot simply goes away. So it really is helpful. The thing you have to watch out for is that it can be a water barrier. So when you're watering your plants, make sure that the water isn't just running off and it gets through. And it does need to be replaced occasionally. What we have done in one of the gardens out at the extension is when we put in what was now called the sharing garden, put down layers of cardboard in the pathways. And that must have been 10 years ago. And it really did suffocate the weeds, and we haven't had to go back and replace that. So using cardboard in areas that are going to be walkways is a good idea. And then you top that with wood chips or whatever organic mulch you want to use. Another one is cover crops. Turf grass is a good example. It is, quite frankly, a very good mulch. I'll talk about that a little bit as we get along. The other is not a physical barrier, but it's a sunlight barrier. Many seeds need sunlight to germinate, and that's what these do. Marshy is the best thing to use. The reason for that is the weed seeds that are in there need a lot of moisture. Even in our typical urban lots, urban gardens, they don't get enough moisture to survive, so that's not a problem. Straw is second best because it doesn't have a lot of weed seeds in it. Under no circumstances should you use hay. You are going to introduce more weeds than you ever want to deal with. Compost is a good mulch. That's a good thing to add 1 or 2 inches every year. You don't till it in, just top dress. The worms will do the rest. The worms will work it down into the soil. Shredded pallet is something I use quite a bit. And the advantage of that is that, well, other than it being inexpensive, is that it's been kiln dried. And so any diseases or bugs or whatever don't exist. So it's a very clean source. Shredded bark, such as cedar bark or something like that, is very good. A lot of people like cedar chips. Personally, I don't, because their advantage is kind of their disadvantage. They last a long time, but it does kind of get gray and drab after a while, and you want to refresh it. Well, you've already got enough mulch out there, so it makes refreshing a little easy, a little more difficult. A couple inches is all you need. Don't put down like 6 inches thinking that, oh, that's going to be a good barrier. I got a note on Gardener SOS about somebody who had a lot of mulch, and he was growing fungus. So you don't need a lot of mulch. Bagged wood chips are another good thing that you can get at any of the big box stores. Bulk wood chips, such as you can get from the city or village. I'm a little hesitant to use those because one of the reasons trees are being trimmed is that they can be diseased. So there's some reluctance to use that. Actually, village or city compost is probably pretty good because that gets to the temperatures that pretty well sterilizes the soil. So you're probably going to have less weed problems introduced from city compost than you would from your own. I talked a little bit about no-till gardening, and when you get a cubic foot of good soil, probably contains about 5,000 weeds. And they're just waiting to be exposed to the sunlight so they'll germinate. So when you till the soil, you let the genie out of the bottle. So, and there's a lot of other reasons for not tilling your vegetable garden. So it saves you a lot of work, and it's better for your garden in general. Okay, now we've talked about mulching. Now that's not going to stop all of the weeds that we've got. So then you have to go back to your bag of tricks. And the next one that you can try is you can try heat. Now there are some real macho tools there, a propane torch. I'd love to have one of those. And you just literally burn them. You can pour boiling water on the weeds. Now those will knock the weeds down immediately, but will not kill the roots. And so they'll come back eventually. But it'll give you a little break. Solarization is something that I felt I should mention. Probably does not work very well in this area because we don't have the prolonged heat. It's going to take 6 weeks or so. Basically, you cover, as you can see by the picture here, they covered clear plastic, not black plastic, clear plastic. And you seal it all the way around so the heat can't escape. And you just let that sit for 6 weeks. And the temperature of the soil, it needs to get to be about 140 degrees, down to about 4 to 6 inches. And that will sanitize the soil. At times this has been used if you get a fungus in the soil, it can be used to take care of that. But it's typically not very effective in this area. So the next thing is polling weeds. The dandelion poller over here, that works good on dandelions that are in the lawn, but doesn't work quite as well if you've got a nice loose soil. There's the tried and true one, the hula hole, and this is my favorite gardening tool. It's called a Cobra head, and this is mine. I've had it for, I don't know, 10 years or so. Super durable. And the one thing that's nice about this is it's narrow. So if you're working in between plants or heavy clay soil, it really works nice. Obviously, this is a short-handled version. There's another one that's smaller than this, and there are also long-handled ones that are available. I don't think I've seen these in any of the nursery stores. Probably need to go online for this. Now, before you get into, to make life easier for yourself, make the weeds easy to pull. Now, you do that by keeping the soil evenly moist. Going back to mulching, and add organic matter to make the soil loose. The looser the soil, the more easy it is to pull the weeds. And the other thing about mulching, when you have it mulched and you keep the soil uniformly moist, weeds are lazy. They'll stay where the moisture is, so the roots will be close to the surface. If you let them dry out, if you don't have any mulch there, the roots will go down and making it more difficult. Here's a quackgrass. But the reason that this is easy to pull, and I love pulling quick, because you get a hold of that thing and you just work it along, and it gives you a feeling of accomplishment. I can do this because my soil is really nice and easy to work with. So that is a big part of making life a little easier for yourself when you're pulling weeds, is to have a nice loose soil. Now I'm going to get out of the flow a little bit here because I wanted to talk specifically about lawn weed control. I've been talking mostly about flower and vegetable beds up to this point, but did want to talk a little bit specifically about lawns. The typical thing that we think of when we're looking at lawns is in the spring, you put down crabgrass preventer. You got to be careful when you apply it. And then after that, you put down your weed and feed, this typical 4-step program. Now, the trouble with broadleaf weed and feed products, the granular, and this is a portion from the Scott's instructions to apply it to a wet lawn. Okay, most people put it down in the middle of the afternoon when the lawn is dry. So any granules that fall on a dry leaf will roll off and they're wasted. The other interesting, and Scott's knows that people don't put it down. Now, because they add this statement here, thicken your lawn to crowd out weeds. This goes back to the concept where turfgrass is a mulch, and build on that concept. Now here's the reality. If you're into a 4-step program kind of thing, you put down your crabgrass preventer. Guess what? 2 weeks later, the dandelions are up. Well, it's too soon to put on the next phase. So what do? Okay, let's just consider this, scrap the whole concept of the 4-step program. If you want to use, what I don't use crabgrass prevention. I don't have crabgrass. And so actually just try it. Chances are very good you won't have it either, but you probably were thinking, well, I don't have crabgrass because I put down the crabgrass preventer. That may not be the case. Or if you do want to use it, put down the crabgrass without fertilizer. Separate the weed prevention and fertilizing. One reason for that is the preventer needs to be put down when the soil temperature is about 55 degrees. And that's too early to be fertilizing. So separate the two functions. And the other thing, when the weed killer or the broadleaves start coming up, don't put down weed and feed, spot treat, or with an herbicide, or pull by hand. Now, the spot treating, you can do that anytime. It's much better for the environment. If you look at putting down weed and feed on your 5,000 square foot lawn, you probably have, let's say, 10 square feet of weeds. So that you're dealing with, but you're applying herbicide to the entire lawn. It isn't going to prevent any weeds that aren't already there. So look at it in terms of reducing your total use of herbicides. So we'll talk a little bit here about everybody's favorite weed is Creeping Charlie. It was one of these plants that was introduced from Europe. I think some of the early settlers brought it in. They wanted to use it as a shade-tolerant ground cover. Well, it certainly did like its new home here. In a vegetable garden, you can be fairly effective at keeping it in control simply by hand pulling it. Again, we're going back to mulch and using that. That will keep it in check a little bit and again, make it easier to pull. In lawns, it's a little more difficult. You can hand pull and it's going to help keep the spread in check a bit, but it's not going to eliminate the weed. What you do need to do there is to have a healthy lawn. Mow regularly to a height of about 3 inches. And that's the key here, is just have a healthy lawn. And herbicides for this should be applied quite late in the year after the first frost. Now, at that time of the year, the weeds are starting to store up, just like trees, just like your maple tree is storing up sap for the winter by sending stuff down to the roots. Creeping Charlie's doing the same thing. So it's translocating a lot of its sugars and whatnot down to the roots. That's when you want to put the herbicide on. It's going to be most effective there because it's getting down to the roots. Be sure the temperature is above 60 degrees. Below that, the activity of the plant slows down and it won't get moved down to where it can do the most good. Okay, now some weeds have still survived and you're getting mad at them. It's time to dig a little deeper into our bag of tricks. And unfortunately, we'll be talking about chemicals. A good share of master gardeners will not use any synthetic chemicals. And I appreciate that. I do use some. But as our role as master gardeners is not to necessarily dissuade people from using them, but recognize the reality that people are going to use them. And if people are going to use them properly. They can have an effect on ourselves and on the rest of the environment. And we need to be responsible if we decide to use them. There's a couple different ways of categorizing herbicides. One is, what do they kill? Non-selective herbicides kill everything. An example of that is Roundup. Selective herbicides only kill certain types of weeds. Broadleaf weeds, for instance, an example of that is Weed Be Gone. And Scott's also makes one for grasses, Grass Be Gone. So if you've got your favorite sedum that's got Kentucky bluegrass growing in it, you might want to consider using Grass Be Gone. And then there's pre-emergent. Now those are a class of herbicides that kill emerging seedlings. Preen is an example of that, and the crabgrass preventer is another example. One thing to remember there is that they prevent all seeds from growing. So if you're in your vegetable garden and you plant some radishes and you put some preen down, hoping to keep the weeds in control, you won't get any radishes. So keep that in mind. I've never used it. Several master gardeners have used it and they tell me they like it. Another way that you can categorize herbicides is how they act. A contact killer kills the only the parts of the plant that are directly contacted. Doesn't kill the roots. So if you look back at the example boiling water, the boiling water kills the leaves but doesn't kill the roots. That's an example of a contact killer. Quite often it's used in combination with a systemic, which is the other category. Systemic or translocated herbicides, it's absorbed through the leaves, goes down to the root, and then the root is killed. So, and those are your longer term, more effective chemical methods of controlling weeds. Now, a lot of you, those of you that have used Roundup, you go out there, you spray it, spray the weed, or whatever, the next, or Weed Be Gone for that matter. You go out and check it the next day, and son of a gun, it's starting to shrivel up. If you go and get a generic Roundup, glyphosate, you spray it down, hey, it took a week. Well, yeah, it does take a week for the glyphosate to work, but what you're really seeing is the impact of contact herbicide that they mixed in with the Roundup. So I hope I explained that correctly. Now, here's the dizzying array of the categories that I've been talking about. I worked at Stein's several years ago, and when business was slow, I would go around and I'd do the exciting thing, read labels. And they have rows and rows and rows of herbicides, and guess what? There aren't that many. There's a lot of brand names, but not that many different herbicides. And what herbicides do, selective herbicides, is they target differences between the weed you want to kill and the plant that you want. For instance, in grass, you got a dandelion, there's something that the herbicide can target. So it targets the fact that the weed is a broadleaf versus a grass. And opposite is true. If you've got grasses growing in your stone crop sedum, there are herbicides that will select specifically for grasses. Again, I've mentioned the pre-emergent. Glyphosate, Roundup. It's the most commonly used herbicide in the world. And it is also the most controversial. It's quite effective, and it's been implicated in some cancers and that sort of thing, and it should not be treated lightly. Yeah, there are alternatives to glyphosate, and there are some trademarks listed below there. I don't know anything about the safety of these other ones relative to Roundup. It gets to be a very complicated issue. In general, when you're working with herbicides, you don't want to get an herbicide on a good plant, one of your landscape plants. So the best thing to do there is to control where that goes. Now, what I like to do when I'm spraying herbicides of any kind is I've got a milk jug and I've cut the bottom off. You put the milk jug over the top of the weed, and you spray into the spout. So you're not going to get any herbicide onto the non-target plant. And this is also where I talk a lot about spot treating. That's the biggest thing you can do to minimize your use of chemicals. For those of you that were at the, that came to Kathy Baum's discussion on shade plants, she talked about using a baby bottle. And you put this would use a concentrated herbicide. You'd get up to your can of Canadian thistle, you break it off the ground, you put 2, maybe 3 drops of the herbicide on, and that's it. The plant's going to be gone. So again, the objective is to minimize your use of herbicides and keep them very confined. And I've talked there's a little more about what to do. Use protective clothing, and gloves, and everybody's got a mask these days. I've got a couple of them. Follow the label instructions. Twice as much isn't twice as good. Don't apply it on a windy day. Keep the overspray controlled. Spot treat as much as possible. Don't apply when it's going to be raining out, because you want to minimize the runoff. And if you're, and keep away from streets and waterways. You don't want to get your overspray going into the street and have it washing down into the sewer system. Many of these are detrimental to aquatic life. So keep in mind that you are working with things that have some drawbacks to them. They have some benefits. So you need to look at how to do things safely and responsibly. Now, you thought chemical herbicides are confusing. Just look at the organic, so-called organic herbicides. That gets even more difficult. There's a lot of different things out there, different claims out there. Some of them are good, some of them are not. Claims that are. I mean by that. What do they contain? Most of them are, many of them are oils or oil mixtures. Clove oil, cinnamon oil, citrus oil. And basically, those are sprayed onto the plant, And the way they function is they dry the plant up. Some others contain soap, vinegar, or salt. A lot of these are home concoctions. For them to work, you want it to be a very hot, sunny day. Remember, you want to dry the plant out, and that's how they're going to be working. So the hotter the day, the brighter the sun, the faster they're going to dry out. Cover the plant completely. They are non-selective. They will kill everything, or at least set it back. And these fall into the category of the contact killers that I mentioned earlier. Typically do not kill the roots. So your perennial weeds will most likely come back in fairly short order. A word about vinegar and salt. You know, I've got what is a typical homemade weed killer thing. A gallon of, well, you can read it there. The main and the effective ingredient here is the salt and the dish soap. The vinegar, household vinegar, is only 5%, which really isn't going to impact the weeds very much. To get a real impact, you have to get up to horticultural vinegar, which is 25%. It'll knock the weeds back, but it's dangerous to handle. And in the homemade version, using household vinegar, you could just as easily use water and it would be almost as effective as using it with vinegar. The downside we have to consider here is that salt is going to linger in the soil. It is going to grab onto the soil and it's going to stay there. So you're going to have a residual effect that's going to be detrimental to the plants that you're leaving behind. So vinegar can increase the acidity to harmful levels. So using these homemade concoctions aren't really going to be the thing you should do. If you want to use these organic ones, go with some of the oils that we'd seen earlier. Go with some of those. They work pretty much the same way by drying out the plant, and they don't have some of the negatives that you see with salt and dish soap. Corn gluten meal. I spent a lot of time researching corn gluten meal. It's really an interesting topic. Back in '91, Iowa State University published a report saying that corn gluten meal was effective at controlling a whole variety of weeds. Well, the weed industry grabbed this report and ran with it. And so there are all sorts of corn gluten meal products on the market now. Now, to use it, timing like other pre-emergent herbicides needs to be applied at the right time, just as the seeds are starting to germinate. And what happens, what this does is it desiccates the seedlings. As the water is soaked up into the corn gluten meal, drying out the seedling, and the seedling never reaches maturity. There's a couple downsides to this. It has to be applied at an extremely high rate. You are going to need 100 pounds of corn gluten meal for 5,000 square feet, typical city lot. That treatment will cost you over $100. And you need to reapply it in a month or so. So if you're going to try it, keep that in mind. I'm looking online for at this. I don't know if I have the next slide with it. At products that have the corn gluten meal in it, and they'll say, well, this 17-pound bag will treat 5,000 square feet, and it has a weed killer in it. Yes, it has a weed killer in it, but it's not at a concentration that's going to be impactful. So be a judicious user. Read the labels. One thing you can do to save a little money is, instead of buying it as a weed controller, buy it as animal feed. You can save some money. I don't recall how much. Go to the Greenville feed mill, not to be confused with the Greenville Co-op, which is across the street. And I drive up in my little car and pull up, and I said, I want some corn gluten meal. And the guy said, well, how many skids do you want? I just bought one bag. So anyway, here's the rest of the story about corn gluten meal. Subsequent studies, including Iowa State, has not been able to duplicate the results of the same study. Rainfall can be a factor. If you are in a season that has a lot of rain, it becomes a fertilizer rather than an herbicide. That doesn't mean that the Iowa study is wrong. It just means that the follow-up studies have shown that it's an extremely complicated process. Give it a try. I've used corn gluten meal 50 pounds on my 5,000 square foot lot and thought it was a great lawn fertilizer. Try it on a small area if you can, or if you want to try that. Vegetable gardens, I'm not quite so sure if that would be such a good thing to do. Corn gluten meal is a very good nitrogen source. And if you put a good nitrogen source on your tomato plants, you'll get beautiful plants, but probably not too many tomatoes. Nitrogen tends to shut down blooming in favor of green growth. So if you want to grow lettuce, go for it. It should work very well for that. If you want to grow tomatoes or peppers, keep in mind that you may be adding too much nitrogen. Now, I've been talking here for almost an hour, and everything boils down to this one slide. This really blew me away. You look at this. Now, somebody went out and treated their garden plots with glyphosate, mulch, preen, vinegar, hand weeding, corn gluten meal, and untreated. Then they went back and measured the amount of time it took them to pull weeds in those plots. Glyphosate, Roundup, and mulch are essentially the same. And you look at corn gluten meal versus untreated, and they're virtually the same. So really, the most effective thing that you can do to control weeds is mulch. Taking this a step further to your lawn, the most effective way of keeping your weeds down in your lawn is to have a healthy lawn. So that brings us to the end. Should I stop screen sharing here, or do you want to do that?
Leave that up. We'll get to questions now. Let's see. Thanks, Tom. That was great. Someone wants to know if they can get copies of the slides. I don't know about that.
Probably not, but I believe the thing is being recorded and is accessible. You
yes,
can watch
it is. The link that you use to get to this will work for another week, and you can watch the recording at that time.
If you want specific information, about specific slides, send an email to the Garden SOS and I can work with you on that. But I prefer not giving out the presentation.
Why is Queen Anne's lace not listed on the list of invasives?
There is a site, if you go to Wisconsin DNR site on invasives, there are 130 invasive species. So I just pick and chose a couple of representative ones. It is listed, it is classified as an invasive. And if you want to go through the whole list, you can find it there.
Okay. Someone has said St. John's wort is a native. What is the issue with this one?
Specifically, I don't know. That we would have to go back and do some research on that. I suspect that it is going wild and is getting into getting out of the garden environment and into the natural environment.
Okay, so what do you recommend for violets and chickweed?
Violets, I had a question on that on Gardener SOS a while ago, and I think both of those would have to be broadleaves. Chickweed, that's large enough, you might be able to pull that, but I would have to go back to using the broadleaf killer on that one. I feel kind of guilty always falling back to the herbicides, but quite often those are the most convenient approaches. The other thing is just pulling.
Responsibly, of course. Where is the best location to get mulch options?
Best look for mulch options?
Yeah.
What was the question again?
Where is the best location to get mulch?
Well, the shredded pallet one, I go out to Skid and Pallet. It's on Lake Road Lane, almost all the way out to Highway 10. It's a pallet recycling facility, and they've got it natural and dyed. They even used to have a blue one. But other than that, just I'd go to nurseries. The bag ones, you can pick them up at any big box store. But for shredded pallets, I'd go out to Skid and Pallet.
If CGM is a fertilizer, isn't that the same as doing crabgrass preventer and fertilizer at the same time?
Fertilizer, yeah, crabgrass preventer and with corn gluten.
Is that the same as CGM?
Yes, it would be. But there are limitations on when it would be working. So, and like I mentioned, you're going to have to apply it at about 100 pounds per 5,000 square feet, and the conditions have to be right for it to be effective.
Oh, someone answered that question about St. John's wort. They said St. John's wort can be toxic to grazing animals.
Oh, it can.
Who knows? Can you mention the online NR40 list for a list of invasives? Online NR40 list for invasives.
Oh, okay. Yeah, that's the NR40 list. That's the DNR site. And I think that's the regulation. If you just enter Wisconsin invasive weeds, that should get you to that site. There are some within that site. I'm trying to remember what it looks like right now, but it does have a section where you can look at regulated and non-regulated plants or animals. Hopefully that answers your question. If not, send an email to SOS and I can send a link to you on that.
Do you have tips for eliminating hairy bitter crusts?
I have no idea what it is. I would have to do some research on that, so no.
What do I do to get rid of Japanese knotweed? It's originating in a neighbor's yard and coming to ours under a fence.
Oh, that thing is this is one of the things where I would say use Roundup, because that thing is huge. It's really a bad one. So go in, hack it down, and use this approach. Cut it off and put some of the glyphosate directly on a cut plant immediately after you cut it down. And walk over to your neighbors and cut some of his down for them. It's a nasty one.
Okay, so it looks like that is all our questions. Thanks, Tom, and thank you all for coming. Next month, we're going to be doing on the 20th, which is also a Monday, we're going to be doing a virtual garden walk. We're going to be visiting like 3 or 4 different gardens and talking to the gardeners, so that should be a good one. Was there another question? How to get rid of snow on the mountain? Some people plant that by person.
Yeah, that would be, I would, dig that one. It depends, this is where it becomes personal choice on whether or not you want to use herbicides. But it would be a dandelion killer, or just be more persistent than it is.
All right, good. I don't see any more questions. So everybody, if you want to see it again, you can just use your link and get back in. Otherwise, that should be it.
I've got the address for Gardener SOS at outofgaming.org. Got that up there again. So thank you for coming.
Your questions answered. Thank you everyone for coming. Bye, Tom.